Okay, well, good afternoon. Welcome to another Policing TV interview. And I'm really privileged to have with me today David Price, Chief of Police on St Helena, Ascension Island, and Tristan Cunha down in the South Atlantic. So, welcome, David, and thank you very much for giving us your time today.
It's very nice to be with you, Trevor.
Excellent. So, what I plan to do, David, is we'll do a few segments here, but I want to start, if I may, with just getting an overview from you of your policing career in the UK, highlights, lowlights, and some of the jobs you've done, because you brought a huge amount of experience down to St Helena. So be pleased if you could just tell us about your time in UK policing.
Okay, Trevor. Well, I joined Merseyside Police in July 1988. In 2 days' time, that'll be 36 years ago. I'd been born and brought up on Madra Avenue, about a quarter of a mile away from the Merseyside Police Training Centre. And as a child, I'd always visited. At that point, there were the horse shows and the dog shows that most forces used to run in the summertime, which were always greatly interesting to a child because the kennels and stables were just around the road. And I went to school round the corner from there, so we had many school visits to the training centre at various times. I also had two cousins who were in the police service in Merseyside, and they all seemed to be having a great time, and it seemed like the sort of career I wanted. I never wanted to work in an office. I liked the idea of having something that was different every day. So in July, after going through the application process, and I remember vividly an inspector coming to do the home visits, which we had to do at that time, telling me that I needed to go and get my hands dirtier somewhere and go work on a production line or do something that was a bit more physical. But nonetheless, I got through the process, turned up at Merseyside on my first day. I think all of us thought we were being wound up because our instructor introduced himself as Ken Dodd, which we thought was just people making up names. His name actually was Ken Dodd, not the Ken Dodd, but another one. So I went through my basic training at Madra Avenue and then at Bruges, at the old regional training centre there, and then was posted out to Admiral Street, which I've been assured by my cousins nobody ever got posted to Admiral Street, which was on the borders of Turks, as their first posting, and I was the only one from my intake that went there. That was an interesting experience, learning to police in an environment right on the edge of the Toxic Triangle, which at that point was still policed by Hope Street rather than Admiral Street. It had its own dedicated section. It was a good grounding in policing. It was never dull. I remember my tutor Collins and the sergeant saying that they weren't terribly worried about process, which was something that my colleagues in the intake were all being driven to do, and they just wanted people being brought through the back door under arrest, which led to some entertainment. At that point, obviously, the rules were slightly different about pursuits. There were none of the safeguards that are in place now. Merseyside was one of the first places with Cheshire and GMP and Lancashire to hire a helicopter outside of the Met, because we had an issue with some of our criminals going around the country ram raiding electronic stores. And I think more or less my first night shift with a tutor constable, I can remember being parked in the Fiesta waiting for a pursuit that had started in Manchester to arrive back in Liverpool 8. And we were monitoring it. You could see the helicopter coming over the houses and the light on it and everything. And then the stolen RS2000, Mark II RS2000, went past us, followed by, at a conservative estimate, 15 police cars from Greater Manchester, Cheshire. There was a Lancashire car, which we never quite worked out how Lancashire got into this, because the pursuit never actually went through Lancashire, but there was a Lancashire car in amongst it. And then numerous Merseyside cars, which was followed by a bit of a tour around Liverpool 8 before the stolen car eventually crashed, and the driver was arrested. The tutor explained that this wasn't absolutely normal, and obviously we weren't going to get involved in a Fiesta, but it was an interesting introduction to night shifts. I stayed at Admiral Street for 5 years, and then went to work in the Management and Legal Services Department, the Research Department at headquarters, which gave me a really interesting insight into how policies and procedures were being developed, and to work with and get to know some of the people at Canning Place, which as a new recruit I'd never met. While I was there, I passed my sergeant exam. I think it was about the second or third year of Osprey, the two-part Osprey, and then went out to Chubrook, which was on the more towards the northern side of Liverpool, and stayed there for 2 or 3 years. Did my first stint as an acting sergeant there, which was memorable. It's always interesting moving from PC to sergeant, and the team there were really supportive in helping me do that. While I was there, I was lucky enough to get a commendation for 3 of us went into a burning building. I think I always maintained that the commendation should have been for gross stupidity and not waiting for the fire service. But anyway, we went in and dragged the guy out, and we got finished in hospital. We got slightly singed, and I can vividly remember it was the first night shift. I went home, and it was a Friday night into Saturday morning. So my wife was tucked up in bed asleep when I got in at 7 in the morning. So I nudged her, told her I was home and I was safe and not to worry, everything was all right. And she grunted something to the effect of, "Yes, I'm sure it is," and rolled back over and went back to sleep. And I dozed off in bed. About half an hour later, I was woken up by her shaking me and asking what the heck had happened, because I had no eyebrows, no eyelashes. What had I done to myself? And so I did explain that I'd mentioned to her that something had happened, but she obviously slept through that bit. So after Chubrook, I went back to Admiral Street and Wavertree Road at that point and worked on the community team. Again, partly as an acting sergeant, partly as supporting the command team there as a part-time staff officer, and also did some work on event planning, which was interesting because again gave me an insight into how things were working. One of the great things about being in Merseyside was we got to work football matches more or less every weekend. There was either Liverpool or Everton playing at home, so there were always opportunities to go down and police Anfield or Goodison. Remembering obviously that you were there, because I'm obviously as a Liverpudlian, I'm a Liverpool fan, I'm a red, not blue. Having to remember that you're there to police the game and not to watch it. We had a chief superintendent who was very keen on making sure that officers were focusing on the crowd and not the game. He used to take great pleasure in walking up behind officers who were looking at the pitch rather than the crowd, and drawing their attention, usually by removing their helmet, clipping them around the top of the head, that they were looking the wrong way. It was very effective. You did get caught more than once doing that. So working the football and doing the event planning was quite interesting. My last job in Merseyside, I was seconded to a national counter-terrorist exercise that was being run. So I had about 8 months working on a planning team with, it was Devon and Cornwall Police, because it involved a ship at sea that was coming into the port of Liverpool. Again, that was something completely new to me. I'd never been exposed to that area before, but I was asked by an inspector I'd worked with to join his team, and it was really, really rewarding. Understanding how counter-terrorism policing worked, how special forces interacted with the police, the various ways that we could do that. At that point, Devon and Cornwall Police were responsible for ships while they were at sea, but in this exercise, for the purposes of it, it was coming into the port of Liverpool. That was a really interesting 8 months of my career, because it was an area of policing I hadn't had any experience of. As a uniform officer, I'd not worked in counter-terrorism, and I had no real idea about how we interfaced with special forces and what the national arrangements were. So I got to meet some very interesting people, show them around the docks in Merseyside at midnight, which was an experience they seemed to enjoy as well. And eventually work on the team that put together the exercise that we had a ship come in, it was contained by the police, it was dealt with in terms of hostages, and eventually the vessel was stormed by special forces, which was, again, a really interesting experience to be part of. While I was a member of that team, towards the end of 1998, Cheshire advertised for sergeants. I'd At that point, it was really, really competitive in Merseyside to be a sergeant, and although I'd been passed for several years, I hadn't managed to get myself promoted. So I threw my hat into the ring with Cheshire, went and did their selection process. Um, the interview was one of the oddest things I've ever done. It was called the 5 card trick, and they used to give you a series of like crib cards placed face down. You chose 5 of them, and you had half an hour to answer all 5 questions with no interaction at all from the board. Um, that was quite an unusual way of doing an interview, but I obviously did all right because I was offered a post as a sergeant, and moved on the 4th of January 1999 to Cheshire. I was promoted sergeant and posted to Sankey in Warrington. Sankey always maintained it was one of the few places, because the police station was on a crossroads, where you could collect your benefit at the post office, go across the road to the pub, drink yourself silly, get locked up for D&D on a Saturday night, and then go to church on the Sunday to confess your sins, all without leaving the crossroads. Sadly, the police station is no more, and I think the post office has gone as well. So that doesn't exist anymore. But moving to Warrington was really interesting. A very different style of policing than urban Liverpool. And getting to know a new force, new ways of working, new procedures, new policies. Being dropped in as a custody officer, having been a PC the day before. The sergeant's course, the transferees course, was about 3 days long and consisted of at least half a day getting your uniform fitted, another half a day on how to log on to the IT systems, a trip to Chester to meet the chief constable, being sworn in by a magistrate, and that was probably about it, really. There was nothing much more than that. And then to discover that I was within a week or 10 days a custody officer in Warrington, having never actually been a custody officer before. Thankfully, we had an excellent jailer who knew more about being a custody officer than I ever did at that point. And whenever a solicitor would start asking a slightly difficult question about a particular detainee, would hand me the good old Xander Bible for custody officers, open to the correct page where I could read the solicitor the bit that I needed to read to him. So Steve, his name was, he was a huge asset and got me through umpteen slightly awkward situations with solicitors who would clearly recognise a brand new custody officer and try and take advantage as much as they could. Warrington was a very Warrington. The nick in the centre of Warrington was a very old Victorian nick. It still had the big drunk cell. One of the cells you could have quite happily thrown 50 or 20 people in, and apparently they used to when it was first opened. But obviously we were down to ones by that point. So the remainder of my career in the UK was spent in and around Cheshire. I moved from Warrington to Chester. Spent a bit of time working on a project team, building new custody suites. During the PFI era, we were moving our headquarters to Winsford. That was one PFI scheme, and at the same point, we were building 3 new custody suites. So again, that was a bit different, working with consultants and accountants and various other people to try and define what custody service looked like. But the result of that was we got 3 very nice custody suites that are still in use at Runcorn, Chester, and near Middlewich. So we moved from our station-based custody to that. Shortly after that, I went back to Halton, which is Widnes and Runcorn, and was acting inspector for a time because I'd passed most of my inspector's exam by then. And was given some responsibilities for teams and duties, and again some emergency planning. So I got to do some of the courses at Easingwold, which was really interesting and really enjoyable, and has been very useful. That experience when I've been out here, and I'll come on to that obviously a bit later. When I was promoted finally to inspector, again, I was drawn onto we were doing a force reorganisation at that point, and I was part of the team that put together the new structure. I don't know what it was about the early 2000s, but most forces seemed to decide at that point they needed to restructure and rename things. So we moved from divisions to areas, and various bits and neighbourhoods. So we introduced a new structure with that, and then once that was finished, Cheshire were getting involved in another national level counter-terrorist exercise. So I put step forward and was selected to do that. So I worked with a team from across the Northwest. It was across all the forces for, again, about 6 months, putting together an exercise that was eventually run in January 2006, quite successfully. Again, a large exercise with an assault by special forces at the end. That, again, is probably the most interesting thing you get to see. Well, you don't see much. You see a lot of bangs and flashes and smoke, and not a great deal else. But you can say that you've been there and watched, which was good. When I came back from that, I went back to Runcorn and was approached by the superintendent, who I knew because I'd worked with him in Merseyside, who informed me that there was a large music festival which is called Creamfields. That for several years prior to that had been run in Liverpool, actually not far from where we live, probably about half a mile away from where we live in Liverpool. It's a dance music festival, and it used to be run on the old airport at Speke. He announced that we'd been told that this was moving to Daresbury, a little village just outside Runcorn on a greenfield site, and would I mind? Well, I don't think it was would I mind. I think it was more of an instruction that I was going to be the planning officer for it. Oh, and by the way, there's a public meeting where you're going to have to explain why we're not objecting to this in 2 days' time. So you've got 2 days to bring yourself up to speed with everything. So I went to a public meeting at a hall in one of the villages near Daresbury, and explained to the public what was going on. Not surprisingly, they weren't exactly keen on having nearly 60,000 revellers turn up one Saturday night in August, on the August bank holiday weekend. But over the course of several months, from April through till August, the team that I was given, that were a group of really good and very, very committed people, we managed to bring together an operation that delivered a reasonably successful first attempt. I would hesitate to say it was absolutely perfect, because it wasn't. We learned an awful lot in that year. And as a result of that, I stayed involved. Creamfields is still there. It's moved from a single day event now up to multiple nights camping with usually about 70,000 people present. And for the rest of my career there, more or less every August bank holiday found me policing Creamfields in one way, shape, or form. That had, again, some memorable nights. The year that it got rained off was very memorable. I was the night shift event commander on site, and it must have been heavy rain, because I wrote in my command log at 4 a.m. that the rain was really falling heavily now, which is most unlike me, because I don't normally comment on the weather. And then I walked across to get some food in the middle of the night and got absolutely drenched in full waterproofs. And within an hour or two, the site was divided by a small stream. That stream had risen from a stream into a raging torrent and basically cut the site in two. And we had elements of the campsite starting to disappear underwater. The team that was on night spent all night wading through campsites, trying to make sure that everybody was out of the tents, the big event tents. Some of them started, the foundations were being undermined. So that eventually the festival was cancelled. But that was an interesting night of decision making. I When was about 2007, 2008, I was given the job of looking after the firearms team and trying to bring together a joint firearms and public order team in Cheshire. That was, again, something new to me. I'd never been a firearms officer. I've been a public order officer my entire career, but never firearms. So I was given that task, qualified as a firearms commander, as a Part A TFC, which I found really, really, really interesting. And I'd also qualified as an event commander at that point. So it was really useful to see the two things, the public order side of it versus the firearms side. Firearms, one of the things I'm most proud of is increasing the representation of female officers in the firearms unit while I was there. I was very fortunate to work with a sergeant at that. Well, it was a PC at that point, a gentleman called Gareth Wrigley, who's now, well, the last I heard of him, he was a superintendent, which is just as well, because when I met him, I told him I expected to call him sir by the time I left, because he had far too much potential to stay as a firearms officer. But he became my training CFI, and with his help, we did some smashing work in terms of bringing and raising the profile of the firearms unit and understanding the reasons why female officers didn't want to join. And trying to create role models within it, which over the course of 7 or 8 years, because it was a long-term project, we moved from 3 officers up to nearly 20 out of the same number. So we significantly increased the percentage. And that rolled forward because I think it was about 2014, 15, Cheshire and North Wales got their heads together and decided that they would create a joint firearms unit. So I worked with my colleague counterpart in North Wales, and we put together a project plan, a training plan, spent a year training together, and then gradually brought the team together, created a new ARV base on the border between Cheshire and North Wales, and dealt with the usual issues of people's reaction to change, from great, this is a marvellous idea from some people, to the outright resistance that I don't want to go to Cheshire stroke North Wales, depending on which side they were on. I'm a Cheshire and North Wales officer, I want to stay here. The language issues with working across the border and making sure that we respect the Welsh language in North Wales. Simple things like what do you mark, what do you put on the cars. In the end, we just put Headley and police on the cars, and that caused all sorts of fun and games with people saying why North Wales in Cheshire and everything. So at that point, social media was growing as well. So we also created a Twitter feed from the firearms unit, which had some resistance from the press office at the time, but we actually discovered got quite a good following. The dog unit, which also eventually became part of the joint unit, was always better followed. And increasing the followers on Facebook for the dog unit was quite simple. I just ordered another puppy, put a picture of it on there, and asked people to suggest names for it, and we got another 1,000 followers overnight. Particularly if it was a cute puppy. But the growth in social media at that point was really useful to us. We were able to evidence what we were doing, and the fact that the firearms team were committed, and the arm team and the dog team were committed to a lot more policing than just that involving their guns and dogs. They were police officers who were supporting the local areas, whether they be Cheshire or North Wales, rural or urban. They were using their skills to back up the local teams, and that was really gratifying to see. So the last 5 years, more or less, of my UK career was spent as the ops manager for that work. We called it the Alliance in the end. It couldn't be a collaboration because the Northwest already had a firearms collaboration. So I think it was one night when we had a royal visit on, myself and the then chief firearms instructor had a text message exchange about if we couldn't be a collaboration, what could we be called? He liked Lord of the Rings and suggested a fellowship. I preferred Star Wars, so we became the Alliance. That's where it finished up. So as I said, I finished up working there. While I was doing that, I was also an event commander. I was very privileged in 2012 to take one of the Cheshire units down to the Olympics. In terms of memorable experiences, that was probably one of the most memorable 4-day periods of my career, working inside the Olympic Park for the first 4 days of the event. Being able to just feel like you're part of probably the biggest, well, certainly the biggest sporting event in the UK in my lifetime. That was really memorable. Policing football matches, such as we had in Cheshire, we never really had. I mean, Crewe Alexandra were our top team, so we weren't quite Premier League standard, but there was always excitement when Crewe played Port Vale or Chester played Wrexham. That was always entertaining. The races at Chester as event commander, varying from the traditional race meetings at the beginning of the season through the stag and hen do's in the later part of the year, which were sometimes a little bit more challenging to police, through running events and running the races during heightened security, where we had armed officers around the place and support from various other bits of the world, of policing and the military. So there were so many memorable experiences. As you know, Trevor, the job is so varied that it was it was really enjoyable to
Yes.
spend 10 years in Merseyside, 21 years in Cheshire, before I decided it was time to move on and do something a little bit different.
But David, there's a couple of things there. I mean, it's extraordinary when I think back. The pursuits did end up with a lot of cars behind him. You really made me smile when you talked about that pursuit early on. But just one thing, a lot of forces, there was a spell when a lot of forces were collaborating. And what was interesting around Cheshire and North Wales, how much did the language, because the Welsh are very proud of their language, and particularly North Wales, I think they're particularly proud of the Welsh language. And some of those mergers and collaborations were really tricky alone. But when you start throwing in language, how much did the language play a part in documentation, markings? And you touched on it, but I just wondered how much that was a factor.
It was a factor, but we made it clear from the start that we were going to respect the way that North Wales worked. North Wales were really good about it. They had a programme that offered us as Cheshire officers the chance to learn Welsh. I was never any good at it, but some of the officers became really, really proficient. We would try and, again, if you were answering the phone, you'd try and use a Welsh greeting if you were speaking to, or you were going to do a presentation. You'd try and at least respect their wishes that we were as bilingual as we could be. And as I say, many of the Cheshire officers, particularly the ones who worked in the new unit we created on the border, took great pride in learning it, and some of them achieved quite good standard of spoken and written Welsh as well. Obviously, English was the primary language for court cases, files, and everything like that, and most of the emails were done that way.
Yeah.
If we needed something, we made sure that we used somebody who actually understood the language properly to make sure you didn't make a complete prat of yourself by using the wrong word at the wrong time in an email if you were trying to be respectful.
Yes. Yeah. And just bringing this session to a close, what I was fascinated about, because I obviously know a lot of what you've achieved on St Helena and a lot of what you've been involved in. I just found it interesting that you seem to build up a really good portfolio in Liverpool and Cheshire in preparedness for St Helena. And I know we're going to talk about that in a moment in a bit more detail. But as I went through, I was kind of mentally thinking, well, that was really handy. You did that in the UK before you went to St Helena. So it was almost preparing you for the role. But David, look, you've had an incredible career in the UK. I was fascinated with, and I didn't realise you were in Merseyside to start with either. And so you've had probably two very different cultural experiences in policing. I don't know much about Merseyside, but all my dealings in my career seem to be fairly unique experiences with Merseyside. So, David, thank you. I'd like to draw this session to a close and just say thank you. And I don't know how much you were reminiscing around your career when you were talking through, but it's certainly just varied. And you touched on it. Policing, the appeal of policing for many is the variations. No day's quite the same. So, David, thank you for joining us this one. We're going to follow up with another session just talking about your time on what come after. And people know you're on St Helena, so I'm not surprising anyone. But just talk about what led you down to the South Atlantic where you're still serving as well. And then probably people will see that your career has probably led up to that with some good experience. So, David, thank you very much for this session. Much appreciated. And we'll talk shortly about life overseas for Chief Price, and we'll come back to them. So, again, thank you for a really interesting talk through your career so far.
Okay, thank you, Trevor. It's been lovely to reminisce.